quiet night, a small roadside diner, and an unexpected storm brewing inside. When a group of dangerous men walk in demanding more than just food, the tension becomes unbearable. But what happens when the wrong people try to intimidate the wrong person? Watch as a simple meal turns into an unforgettable showdown that no one saw coming. Don't miss this intense story. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to see more powerful stories like this. Let us know in the comments, what would you do in this situation? The dim glow of the neon sign flickered in the rain as John Cena stepped into the small roadside diner. A bell above the door chimed softly, and the warmth of the place immediately contrasted with the damp chill outside. The aroma of fresh coffee, grilled burgers, and toasted bread filled the air, mingling with the quiet hum of an old radio playing a slow blues tune. The wooden floor creaked slightly under his weight as he moved towards the counter, scanning the modest interior. A few truckers sat hunched over their meals, a newspaper crinkled in the hands of an elderly man near the window. Behind the counter, a young black woman wiped a table with practiced efficiency. Her name tag read Lauren, and she moved with the tired but determined energy of someone used to long shifts. Her dark curls were pulled back into a ponytail, and her uniform, though neat, showed signs of a hard day's work. She glanced up as John approached, her brown eyes holding a flicker of curiosity before she straightened and offered a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. What can I get you?" John returned the smile, his deep voice calm. "Double burger, fries, and a coffee." Lauren nodded, jotting the order down in her notepad. "Coming right up." She turned towards the kitchen, but something about the stiffness in her shoulders caught his attention. It wasn't just exhaustion. There was tension there, a guarded look in her eyes, as if she was expecting something unpleasant to happen. John settled into a corner booth, stretching his legs and leaning back against the seat. He wasn't looking for trouble tonight, just a meal and some peace. But his years in the ring and his time navigating the real world had honed his instincts. Something felt off. He noticed how Lauren's movements became a little faster, her head tilting towards the door slightly as if listening for something. And then it happened. The front door slammed open with a force that made the bell jangle violently. The air in the diner seemed to shift, the quiet conversations at the tables abruptly cutting off. 5 men strode in. Their presence alone was enough to change the atmosphere. Leather jackets with faded patches, heavy boots that thudded against the wooden floor, a lingering stench of motor oil and cigarette smoke trailing behind them. They weren't here for food. John didn't need to look at Lauren to know she had gone rigid behind the counter. The leader, a stocky, middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep scar running across his cheek, surveyed the room with the casual arrogance of someone who had already decided he owned the place. His name was Rick, and the moment his pale blue eyes landed on Lauren, his lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well, look at this," Rick drawled, walking to the counter and planting both hands down with a loud slap. "Our favorite little waitress is still here. Thought you would have learned by now, girl." John saw it then, the barely perceptible twitch in Lauren's jaw, the way her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the counter. "Whatever you want, I'm not giving it to you," she said, her voice steady despite the sharp edge of tension in it. One of the other bikers, a lanky man with a chipped tooth, laughed. "Oh, I think you will. You always do eventually." Lauren's knuckles whitened, but she held her ground. "This is a business, not your playground." Rick let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in amusement. He reached out and plucked a sugar packet from the counter, rolling it between his fingers as if considering something. "See, that's where you're wrong," he said. "This diner is in our territory, which means you pay if you want to keep it running. It's how things work around here." John could feel the shift in the room. The tension thickened, suffocating in its weight. The other patrons in the diner looked away, their heads ducked down, pretending not to notice. Fear was a familiar scent here, and John hated it. Lauren stood her ground. "I told you last time, I'm not giving you a damn cent." Rick sighed dramatically, tossing the sugar packet onto the counter. "See, I don't like that attitude, that kind of disrespect. It gets people into trouble." He turned to his men. "Doesn't it, boys?" The chipped-tooth biker grinned, stepping forward. "Oh yeah, big trouble." The third biker, a wiry guy with a tattoo crawling up his neck, suddenly reached over and knocked over a tray of silverware, sending a clatter of knives and forks onto the floor. Lauren flinched. John's grip on his coffee mug tightened. Rick leaned in closer to Lauren, lowering his voice just enough for the threat to feel more personal. "You either pay up or bad things start happening," he said, his voice like oil sliding over gravel. "Windows get broken. Fires start. People get hurt." And then he reached for her wrist. John moved before he could think. His hand shot out, catching Rick's wrist in a grip so strong it made the biker suck in a sharp breath. A dead silence fell over the diner. Rick turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing as he registered the iron hold on his arm. His gaze traveled up to meet John's face, recognition dawning as the biker took in the broad shoulders, the massive forearms, and the calm but unmistakably dangerous look in his eyes. One of the bikers whispered, "Shit, that's John Cena." John didn't move, didn't speak. His fingers dug into Rick's wrist just enough to send a message, a warning. Rick chuckled, but there was an edge of unease in it. "Well, damn," he mused. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. John spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You've had your fun. Now leave." For a moment, Rick hesitated, his pride warred with common sense, with the heavy presence of the man holding his wrist like a steel vise. The other bikers were already looking at him, waiting for his call. Then something changed in his expression. The hesitation vanished, replaced by something darker. Rick grinned. "You think being a big-time wrestler means something in the real world?" He wrenched his arm free, stepping back. "News flash, tough guy. This ain't the ring. Out here, your moves don't mean shit." The bikers laughed, their unease evaporating. John remained unmoved. Rick cracked his knuckles. "All right, boys. Looks like we'll have to teach our Hollywood friend here a little lesson." John exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. The fight was coming, and John was ready. The diner was silent, the air thick with tension as Rick's men spread out, forming a loose semicircle around John Cena. The other patrons shrank back, some clutching their drinks while others pretended to be focused on their meals, unwilling to get involved. The only sound was the steady hum of the old jukebox in the corner, still playing a slow blues tune that now seemed eerily out of place. Lauren stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting between the bikers and John. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression remained defiant. Rick rolled his shoulders and smirked, confidence returning now that he had his crew backing him up. He wiped his wrist as if shaking off the lingering grip of John's hand. His blue eyes gleamed with something predatory. "You see, boys," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, "this guy thinks just 'cause he's famous, he can walk into our place and tell us what to do." He turned to Cena. "But you're in the real world now, big shot. No cameras, no scripts, just fists." The other bikers chuckled, emboldened by their leader's bravado. The chipped-tooth biker took a step forward, cracking his knuckles, while the one with the neck tattoo ran a hand along his belt as if preparing to pull something out. The tension became suffocating, the diner now feeling much smaller than before. John remained seated, his fingers lightly tapping the table, his expression calm, but his muscles were taut, ready. He knew how this worked. Guys like Rick thrived on fear, on the power they had over those too afraid to stand up to them. They wanted to intimidate, to make him react first. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Rick noticed John's lack of fear and scoffed. "Look at him, boys. All that muscle, and he's just going to sit there." He leaned in, resting his hands on the table. His breath reeked of whiskey and cheap cigarettes. "Tell me something, Cena. How's it feel to be outnumbered for once?" John lifted his eyes to meet Rick's, his gaze like steel. "I've been in worse situations." Rick's smirk faltered for just a second. Then he straightened and nodded toward his men. "Teach this Hollywood punk a lesson." The first move came fast. Chipped Tooth lunged forward, swinging a heavy right hook aimed at John's jaw. But John had already seen it coming. He ducked at the last second, the punch grazing over his head, and in a single motion he drove his shoulder into the biker's gut, lifting him off his feet and slamming him onto the table with a loud crash. Plates shattered, silverware scattered, and the entire table buckled under the impact. The diner erupted into chaos. Another biker, the one with the neck tattoo, tried to grab John from behind, wrapping an arm around his throat. John reacted instantly, grabbing the biker's wrist and twisting it sharply. The man let out a pained yell, but John wasn't finished. With one powerful motion, he hoisted him up and slammed him down in a modified belly-to-belly suplex. The floorboards shook from the impact. The third biker, a burly man with a thick beard, grabbed a chair and swung it at John's back. The wood splintered on impact, but Cena barely flinched. He turned, eyes flashing, and drove a devastating elbow into the biker's face, sending him sprawling into a booth. Rick's smirk had vanished. He wasn't laughing anymore. One of his remaining men hesitated before pulling out a switchblade. Lauren gasped, "John, watch out!" The blade flashed as the biker lunged. John sidestepped just in time, grabbing the man's wrist and slamming it against the counter, forcing him to drop the weapon. Before the biker could react, Cena gripped him by the collar and sent him flying across the diner, where he landed with a painful thud against a jukebox, making the music cut out abruptly. Now it was just Rick. The leader of the gang stood there, his eyes flicking between his groaning, fallen men and John, who hadn't even broken a sweat. The remaining customers, who had been hiding behind tables and booths, slowly peeked out, their expressions a mix of shock and awe. John cracked his neck and took a step forward. Rick instinctively reached behind his jacket and pulled out a brass knuckle, slipping it onto his right hand. "You got some fight in you, I'll give you that," Rick growled. "But I ain't like my boys. I know how to take down a big guy like you." John smirked. "You sure about that?" Rick lunged, throwing a brutal punch aimed straight at Cena's face. But John was faster. He sidestepped, grabbed Rick's arm mid-swing, and with sheer strength twisted him around before lifting him up. Lauren's eyes widened. She had seen wrestling before, but watching it happen in real life was something else entirely. With a swift, powerful motion, John hoisted Rick onto his shoulders and executed a perfect attitude adjustment, slamming him down onto a broken table. The wood snapped under the force, and Rick let out a choked groan before going completely still. The diner fell silent. All 5 bikers were down. Lauren stared, her breath shaky, her heart hammering. John dusted off his hands and glanced around the wrecked diner. Booths were overturned, shattered dishes covered the floor, and the jukebox sparked where the last biker had crashed into it. Rick coughed, rolling onto his side, groaning in pain. You're gonna regret this," he wheezed. John crouched down beside him, voice low but firm. "No, you're gonna regret this. You and your boys are done here." He pointed to the door. "You ever come near this place again, I won't go easy on you next time." Rick said nothing, his breath ragged. Sirens wailed in the distance. John stood up as the distant glow of police lights flashed through the rain-speckled windows. The bikers, barely conscious, groaned as they tried to pull themselves up. Lauren finally found her voice. "John, John turned to her, his expression softening. "You okay?" She let out a shaky breath and nodded. I think so." The front door swung open again, but this time it wasn't more trouble. It was the cops. John sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Looks like the cleanup crew is here." The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-slicked pavement outside the diner as two police cruisers skidded to a stop. The sirens cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of slamming doors and hurried footsteps. Officers in dark uniforms rushed into the diner, hands on their holsters, scanning the wreckage before them. The scene was pure chaos. Overturned tables, shattered dishes, and 5 battered, groaning bikers sprawled across the floor. John Cena stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching as the officers took in the mess. Lauren was still behind the counter, gripping it so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The few customers who had remained in the diner sat in stunned silence, some whispering among themselves. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with graying hair stepped forward, his name tag reading Sergeant Michaels. He narrowed his eyes at the sight of Rick, still lying atop the shattered remains of a table, barely able to move. The sergeant exhaled through his nose and shook his head. "Well, well, if it ain't Rick and his boys." His tone was dry, unimpressed, as if this were far from the first time he had encountered them. He turned his gaze to Lauren. "They givin' you trouble again?" Lauren nodded, though her voice was steadier than before. "They came in demanding money for protection. When I refused, they started threatening me. Then they tried to get physical." Sergeant Michaels let out a tired sigh and pulled out a small notepad. "That sounds about right." He turned to his partner, a younger officer with a sharp jawline. "Call it in. We're taking them in for extortion, assault, and destruction of property." Rick let out a low groan and tried to sit up, but the pain from Cena's attitude adjustment was still keeping him down. This is bullshit," he wheezed. "That big bastard attacked us first." One of the other bikers, still holding his ribs from being thrown into the jukebox, nodded weakly. Yeah, we were just minding our own business. He jumped us." Sergeant Michaels raised an eyebrow. "You really expect me to believe that?" Rick sneered. "Check the damn cameras. That freak attacked first." Before the officer could respond, a voice from the corner spoke up. "Actually, I got the whole thing right here." All heads turned toward a young man in a trucker cap sitting in a booth near the window. He held up his phone, the screen still recording. "Got every second of it. These guys came in harassing the lady, calling her all kinds of racist shit, knocking things over. They even pulled a knife on him." He gestured toward Cena. "Man only fought back when they tried to attack him." Sergeant Michael's expression remained unreadable as he took the phone from the man's hand and watched a few seconds of the footage. Slowly, he nodded. "Well, looks like that settles it." He looked down at Rick, who had gone pale. "Anything else you'd like to add?" Rick clenched his jaw. He had lost. The sergeant signaled his officers. "Cuff 'em." Within seconds, the officers were pulling zip ties from their belts and yanking the bikers to their feet. Rick struggled for a moment, but winced in pain from the fight. One of his men, the one with the broken nose, groaned. "Man, you don't gotta be so rough." "You don't gotta be such a dumbass," Michaels muttered, securing his wrists. He looked toward Lauren. "You pressin' charges?" Lauren hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Cena, then back at the sergeant. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but there was something else there now, something firm, unwavering. "Yes." Rick's head snapped up. "What?" Lauren took a breath. "I should have done it the last time they came in here, but I was scared. Not anymore." Rick's face contorted in rage, but Michaels pushed him forward. "You heard her." He looked over at Cena. "You need to come down to the station to give a statement?" Cena shook his head. "You got video evidence, witnesses. I think that's enough." Michaels studied him for a second before nodding. "Fair enough. Appreciate what you did here tonight." Cena didn't respond, just gave him a small nod. As the officers dragged the bikers toward the door, Rick twisted his head to glare at Lauren. "You're making a mistake, girl. You think this is over? I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up." Cena took a single step forward, and Rick immediately shut his mouth. His body tensed involuntarily, remembering the power behind those hands. Cena leaned down just enough to look him in the eye. "This is over," he said quietly. "You come near her again, and I won't stop at just putting you through a table." Rick swallowed hard. He believed him. Michaels gave a sharp tug on Rick's cuffs, dragging him out of the diner. One by one, the rest of the bikers were taken outside and stuffed into the back of the cruisers. The sound of the doors slamming shut echoed through the night. Inside, the diner was silent. The tension had lifted, but the weight of everything that had just happened still lingered. Customers started moving again, some whispering in amazement, others murmuring among themselves. A few people stole glances at Cena, as if still processing that the John Cena had just taken down an entire gang in their small-town diner. Lauren exhaled slowly, running a hand through her curls. She turned to Cena, her expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." Cena shrugged. "Yeah, I did." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You know, you just single-handedly did what I've been too afraid to do for months. Those guys, they've been running this town like it belongs to them. Nobody ever stands up to them." Cena leaned against the counter. "Well, looks like that just changed." Lauren studied him for a moment. "Why'd you step in?" Cena was quiet for a beat before answering. "Because too many people look the other way when this kind of thing happens. I've seen it before. Figured it was about time somebody didn't." Lauren swallowed, her throat tight. She had spent so long feeling powerless against people like Rick, so long trying to convince herself that as long as she stayed out of their way, she'd be safe. But seeing what had happened tonight, seeing someone refuse to be intimidated, refuse to let them win, made something inside her shift. The diner door swung open again, but this time it was a customer who had been hiding behind a booth. A woman in her 50s, still clutching her purse, stepped forward. "That was incredible," she murmured. "You really showed them." A man near the window nodded. "Yeah, that was the best thing I've seen all year." Another chuckled. "Forget movies, Cena. You should do this full time." Cena smirked, shaking his head. "I'll stick to wrestling." Lauren laughed softly, the first real laugh she had let out in what felt like ages. She turned and grabbed a clean coffee mug. "Well, I don't know about you, but I could really use a cup of coffee." Cena chuckled, sliding into his booth again. "You know what? I think I'll have that burger now." Lauren grinned, already moving toward the kitchen. Outside, the police cars pulled away, their sirens off, but their presence still lingering in the air. The night was quieter now, calmer. The town didn't feel as small anymore, and inside the diner, things finally started to feel right. The diner had finally started to return to normal, but the damage left behind was impossible to ignore. Shattered glass and broken furniture were scattered across the floor, and a few booths had been overturned in the chaos. The jukebox, which had been playing moments before the fight, now sat at an awkward angle against the wall, wires exposed where the impact had knocked it loose. The neon "open" sign flickered in the window, struggling to stay lit after one of the bikers had been thrown into it. Lauren moved carefully through the wreckage, picking up overturned chairs and gathering broken plates. The adrenaline from the fight had worn off, leaving her feeling drained but strangely light. She had spent so many nights dreading encounters like this, flinching every time the bell over the door rang. But tonight was different. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally breathe. John was still seated at his booth, his meal untouched but no longer forgotten. His hands rested on the table, fingers loosely curled around the coffee mug that Lauren had given him after the fight. He had barely taken a sip. Instead, he watched her, his expression unreadable as she worked. "You don't have to do that," he finally said. Lauren glanced up from where she was kneeling, sweeping up pieces of a broken salt shaker. "Somebody's got to clean this place up," she said, forcing a small smile. "Might as well be me." John nodded but didn't look convinced. He leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. "You okay?" She stopped what she was doing for a second, fingers tightening around the broom handle. Was she okay? She wasn't sure. She had faced down those bikers before, but this time things had escalated further than she had ever imagined. They had threatened her before, pushed her around, but never had they been taken down so brutally. "I think so," she said eventually. She looked at him, really looked at him. "I should be asking you that. Those guys weren't exactly pulling their punches." John smirked slightly, rolling his shoulder. "I've had worse." Lauren shook her head, muttering under her breath. "Of course you have." The front door creaked open again, and she stiffened instinctively, but this time it wasn't another threat. Instead, a few of the customers who had hidden during the fight started emerging from their booths, cautiously stepping forward. Some still looked wary, their eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the bikers to come storming back in, but others looked at John with something else in their expressions: relief, admiration, maybe even hope. One of the truckers, a grizzled older man with a thick gray beard, crossed his arms over his chest. "Hell of a thing you did, son," he said, his voice gruff but approving. "Ain't never seen nobody put those bastards in their place like that." A woman near the counter, still clutching her purse, nodded. "They've been shaking people down for years. No one ever stands up to them. We all just let it happen." Lauren swallowed hard. She knew it was true. The bikers had run this part of town like they owned it, demanding money from businesses, terrorizing the people who refused to pay up. Most folks had just learned to live with it, avoiding conflict, keeping their heads down. John didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked around at the faces watching him, studying the mix of fear and relief. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and sat forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's how they keep control," he said. "They make you feel like there's nothing you can do, like standing up to them isn't worth it." The trucker nodded. "Yeah, and sometimes it ain't, not when they got numbers like they do." "But they're not invincible," Lauren said suddenly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. She set down the broom, looking around the diner. "They act like they own this place, but they don't. And if people stop being afraid of them, if more of us fight back, maybe they'll realize that." Silence followed her words, heavy and thoughtful. John gave her a small nod, like he approved of what she was saying. "You're right." The trucker let out a low chuckle. "Guess the question is, what happens now?" Lauren hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? The bikers were gone for now, but Rick's parting words still echoed in her mind. "You think this is over?" "I got people." She forced herself to push down the lingering fear. "Now, I file a report, press charges, and hope the cops actually do their job." "Hope's a funny thing," John murmured. Lauren met his gaze. "You don't think it'll be enough?" John sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "I think it's a good start, but guys like Rick, they don't just disappear because they get arrested once. He's going to be pissed, and if he's got people like he says, they'll be coming." The words settled over the diner like a weight. The woman at the counter swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" John glanced around the room. "You don't let fear win," he said simply. "If they come back, you stand together. You don't let them push you around anymore." The trucker snorted. "Easier said than done." John's expression hardened slightly. "It's not about what's easy. It's about what's right." The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy with fear. It was heavy with determination. Lauren nodded slowly, turning back to the counter. "Then I guess I better make that call." She picked up the diner's old landline and dialed the police station. The line rang twice before a dispatcher picked up. "This is Lauren James from the roadside diner on Carson Street," she said, her voice steady. "I'd like to file a formal complaint against Rick Dawson and his crew. Extortion, property damage, assault." She met John's eyes as she spoke, the weight of what she was doing settling fully in her chest. But this time, she wasn't afraid. This time, she wasn't alone. John watched her for a moment before finally lifting his coffee cup and taking a long sip. "About time," he muttered under his breath. The diner wasn't fixed. The town wasn't fixed. But something had changed tonight, and for the first time in a long time it felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The air in the diner felt different now. The tension that had filled the space just an hour ago had started to dissolve, replaced by something else, something quieter, heavier. The immediate threat was gone. The bikers were in police custody, and yet the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air like the scent of burnt coffee. Lauren stood behind the counter, the phone still in her hand after speaking with the police, her fingers gripping the receiver a little too tightly. She had done it. She had pressed charges. She had finally taken a stand. But the fear in her chest hadn't disappeared completely. If anything, it had simply changed shape. John Cena was still seated at his booth, his broad frame relaxed, though his sharp eyes took in every detail of the room. He had seen situations like this before. People thinking the battle was over when, in reality, it was just beginning. Rick's words echoed in his head. "I got people, and they don't like it when one of their own gets locked up." It wasn't an empty threat. He could feel it in his gut. The question wasn't if Rick's crew would retaliate, it was when. The other patrons of the diner had started moving again, some gathering their things, others murmuring in hushed voices. A few approached Lauren to offer words of encouragement, but most of them simply nodded in her direction, their eyes filled with something that looked like relief. They had seen her stand up to them. They had seen Cena take them down. And now, for the first time in a long time, maybe there was hope. Lauren exhaled and set the phone down, rubbing her temples. She felt exhausted. Her body still buzzed with the leftover adrenaline from the fight, but her mind was already racing ahead to what might come next. She turned to look at Cena. "You really think they'll come back?" Cena met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. Lauren swallowed hard. She had expected that answer, but hearing it out loud made her stomach twist. "Great," she muttered, grabbing a rag and mindlessly wiping down the counter. "Just what I needed." Cena watched her for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You afraid?" Lauren let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course I'm afraid. Those guys have been running this place like their own personal kingdom for years. They don't just let things go." She shook her head. "Rick's the worst of them, but he's not the only one, and if he's got people outside of town, like he says—" She trailed off, her grip tightening on the rag. Cena nodded, his expression serious. "You did the right thing pressing charges." "I know," Lauren said, but her voice was quieter now. She glanced towards the broken furniture, the shattered glass still glinting under the dim lights. "Doesn't mean it won't cost me." Cena understood. He had seen this before. The fight wasn't just about throwing punches, it was about standing up when it was easier to back down. It was about refusing to live in fear, even when fear was the easier choice. He had learned that lesson a long time ago, and now he could see Lauren learning it too. The bell above the diner door jingled, and both of them tensed slightly. But it wasn't trouble this time. 2 officers stepped inside, the younger one from earlier and an older man who had the tired look of someone who had seen too much of the world. They scanned the room before approaching Lauren. "You the one who called in the charges?" the older officer asked. Lauren straightened. "Yeah, that was me." The officer gave her a nod. "Good. We've been after Rick and his crew for a while now, but nobody ever wanted to go on record. Your statement, plus the footage from that guy's phone, might actually make it stick this time." Lauren felt something loosen in her chest, but she didn't let herself relax just yet. "So they're really being charged?" "Oh yeah," the officer confirmed. "Rick's looking at multiple counts of extortion and assault. The others? Same deal. We'll see how much of it holds in court, but they won't be walking free anytime soon." For the first time that night, Lauren let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The younger officer glanced at Cena, his expression shifting slightly. "And you," he said, almost cautiously. "Not every day we see a guy like you getting involved in something like this." Cena shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. The officer let out a low chuckle. "Well, whatever the case, you sure made an impression." He glanced at the broken furniture. And one hell of a mess. Lauren winced, looking around at the destruction. "Yeah, the owner's not going to be happy about this." "You the manager?" the older officer asked. "No, just a waitress," she said, then hesitated. "But the owner barely comes around. I practically run the place at this point." The officer nodded. "You let us know if those guys come back. We'll keep an extra patrol near here for the next few weeks, just in case." Lauren didn't know how much that would help, but it was something. As the officers left, the diner settled into a strange kind of quiet. The remaining customers finished their meals, some still throwing glances at Cena like they couldn't believe he was actually here. Lauren sighed and leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I think I'm going to need about 3 days' worth of sleep after this." Cena smirked. "You and me both." She looked at him again, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Why'd you do it?" Cena raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" She gestured vaguely to the wreckage around them. "Step in, fight them, risk getting hurt. You didn't owe me anything." Cena was silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Because I've seen too many people let fear win," he said finally. "And I'm tired of it." Lauren swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She thought about all the times she had stayed silent, all the times she had let them walk all over her because she was too afraid to fight back. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." Cena studied her for a second before nodding. "Good." She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're something else, Cena." He smirked. "So, I've been told." Lauren let out a breath, looking around the diner one more time. It was a mess, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a place she was trapped in. It felt like a place worth fighting for. And she had a feeling she wasn't the only one who thought so. The diner had quieted, but the events of the night still lingered in the air. The broken furniture, the shattered glass, the overturned booths, everything told a story of what had happened, a story that would not be easily forgotten. Lauren moved slowly as she cleaned, her hands still shaking slightly, but there was something else in her now, a kind of determination she hadn't felt before. She wasn't just picking up pieces of a broken diner. She was reclaiming something that had been taken from her long ago. John Cena sat at his booth, finally taking a bite of the burger that had gone cold during all the chaos. He chewed thoughtfully, watching Lauren as she worked. She had been through a hell of a night, but she wasn't backing down. He could respect that. He had seen too many people fold under pressure. Too many people accept the way things were just because it was easier. But Lauren had made a choice. She had stood her ground. The bell over the door jingled, and both of them tensed instinctively. But it wasn't trouble this time. The trucker who had recorded the fight walked in, his phone still in his hand, a cautious look on his face. He looked around at the wreckage, then let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "Looks even worse now that the adrenaline's worn off." Lauren smirked, wiping down the counter. "Yeah, well, guess I'll be busy tomorrow." The trucker walked up to her, his expression turning serious. "Just wanted to say, you did good tonight, standing up to them like that." Lauren hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks." He glanced at Cena. "And you, man. I mean, hell, I've seen you on TV, but that was something else." Cena smirked. "Guess I still got it." The trucker chuckled, then held up his phone. "So, about this video, you want me to put it online?" Lauren frowned slightly. "You think it'll help?" "Are you kidding?" the trucker said. "The whole world's going to see those guys for what they really are. That's one thing when they run around town bullying people, but when they get taken down by John Cena in a diner fight, people are going to pay attention." Cena looked at Lauren, letting her make the decision. She thought about it for a long moment. She had spent so long trying to avoid attention, trying not to make waves, but maybe that was the problem. Maybe people like Rick counted on people like her staying quiet. Maybe it was time to be loud. "Post it," she said. The trucker grinned. "Consider it done." He walked off to a booth and started editing the video, and Lauren turned back to Cena. "You think that was the right call?" Cena shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I think. What matters is you're not letting fear make your choices for you." Lauren exhaled. "Guess we'll see what happens." A few more customers had started to return, cautiously stepping inside to see if things were back to normal. The woman who had been clutching her purse earlier sat at the counter and gave Lauren a small smile. "You think they'll be back?" Lauren's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Maybe," she admitted. "But if they do, I won't be the same person they pushed around before." Cena smirked at that. "Now that's what I like to hear." She rolled her eyes. "You sticking around to see what happens?" Cena leaned back, stretching his arms. "Tempting, but I got places to be." Lauren nodded, pretending that didn't disappoint her a little. "Well, I guess I owe you a meal at least." Cena chuckled. "Damn right you do." She grabbed another plate and put together a fresh burger for him, sliding it across the counter. He picked it up, took a bite, and nodded in approval. "Now this is worth the wait." She smirked. "Glad you approve." The door opened again, and this time it was one of the younger cops who had been there earlier. He walked up to Lauren and set a card on the counter. "In case you need anything," he said, "we're going to keep an eye on things, but just in case." Lauren picked up the card, running her thumb over the printed number. It was a small thing, but it meant something. She wasn't alone in this. Cena finished his burger, wiped his hands, and stood up. "Well, guess that's my cue." Lauren looked at him, hesitating for just a second. Then she reached across the counter and held out a hand. "Thanks, Cena, for everything." He took her hand and shook it firmly. "Any time." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused and looked back. "And Lauren?" She raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" He smirked. "Next time someone like Rick walks through that door, you already know what to do." She smiled, a real smile this time. "Yeah, I do." Cena nodded, then pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. Lauren watched him go, then turned back to the diner. It was still a mess. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Justice has been served, but the question remains, what happens next? Some battles are fought with fists, but the real fight is about standing up for what's right. Would you have done the same in this situation? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you handle a moment like this? Let's talk about it.